Every winter, in homes and city squares, a small and familiar ritual unfolds. A 9-branched menorah, colored candles, a tiny flame added each night. There are songs, fried foods, gifts, children spinning dreidels. It is cozy, bright, and, at least on the surface, simple. Hanukkah, we are told, is the festival of lights, a celebration of hope against the darkness. But if you stand back from the glow for a moment and let your eyes adjust, the outlines of something stranger begin to appear. Behind the cheerful latkes and the chocolate coins is a story of civil war, political calculation, and a miracle that arrives rather late to its own party. To my mind, that quiet disconnect, the warmth of the feast and the sharpness of its origin, is where things begin to feel just a little uncanny. So, let us walk back candle by candle into the 2nd century before the Common Era, to see what actually lies behind this 8-day celebration. We begin in Judea, under the rule of the Seleucid Empire. After the death of Alexander the Great, his empire fractured and this region fell under Greek-speaking kings based in Syria. For a time, things were tense but manageable. Around the early 2nd century before the Common Era, under Antiochus III, Jewish communities were generally allowed to keep their laws and customs. Greek culture was present but not yet imposed with a clenched fist. That changes under his son, Antiochus IV, who took the rather confident title Epiphanes, meaning God manifest. His reign is where the Hanukkah story usually begins to darken. Around the year 168 before the Common Era, Antiochus launches a systematic effort to reshape Judean religious life. Sabbath observance, Torah study, and circumcision are banned. Copies of the Torah are burned. Women who circumcise their sons are reportedly put to death. And at the very heart of Jewish worship, the temple in Jerusalem, he orders something that would have felt like a spiritual earthquake. He desecrates the altar, likely by dedicating it to Zeus, and offers forbidden animals upon it. Later, Jewish tradition remembers pigs paraded through the sanctuary. While details vary, the point is consistent. The most sacred space in Jewish life is treated as a stage for pagan worship. At one level, this is a familiar story of empire and repression. But here is where things start to diverge from the gentle holiday play you might see in a school auditorium. Because the Maccabean revolt that follows is not only a righteous uprising against foreign tyranny, it is also, uncomfortably, a civil war. The first book of Maccabees, written not long after these events and preserved today in the Apocrypha, does not focus on spinning tops or miracle oils. It speaks instead of Jews who welcomed Hellenistic reforms, who built a gymnasium in Jerusalem, who adopted Greek names, who sought high positions by cooperating with Seleucid power. For them, Greek culture was sophistication, progress, perhaps even survival. For others, particularly in the countryside and the priestly town of Modin, this looked like betrayal. Here we meet Mattathias, a priest, and his sons, John, Simon, Eleazar, Jonathan, and Judah, who will become known as the Hammer, or Maccabeus. When a royal officer arrives in Modin to enforce pagan sacrifice and calls on Mattathias to set an example, the priest refuses. According to 1 Maccabees, when another Jew steps forward to offer the sacrifice instead, Mattathias kills both the officer and the would-be collaborator on the spot. It is a shocking scene, and it is the spark of the revolt. From this moment, the conflict is not just Jews versus Greeks. It is Jews versus Jews over what it means to be faithful, what it means to adapt, and where the line of compromise finally breaks. We will come back to this uncomfortable civil dimension a little later. It lurks beneath a great deal of what follows. Mattathias and his sons flee to the hills, attracting followers. What begins as an act of defiance becomes organized guerrilla warfare. From roughly 167 to 164 before the Common Era, Judean fighters ambush Seleucid patrols, tear down pagan altars, circumcise children in secret, and slowly reclaim territory. Special units enforce Torah law in reclaimed villages. It is a revolt for religious freedom, but also a campaign of purification. The military heart of the story is Judah Maccabee. He leads increasingly daring attacks, culminating in the recapture of Jerusalem. By the year 164 before the Common Era, the Maccabees seize the Temple Mount. What they find there, according to 1st and 2nd Maccabees, is devastation. Defiled altars, pagan structures, sacred vessels stolen or misused. The texts linger on the emotional weight of this moment. The priests in sackcloth, the sound of flutes and harps returning as the sanctuary is reclaimed. Then comes the event Hanukkah is named for, the dedication, or in Hebrew, the Hanukkah of the temple. The Maccabees tear down the polluted altar, build a new one, reconstruct the sanctuary, and on the 25th of the month of Kislev, they inaugurate an 8-day celebration. The books of Maccabees emphasize music, sacrifices, festal offerings, and lights. There is a deliberate echo here. The 8 days look strikingly like the festival of Sukkot, the autumn pilgrimage feast that could not be properly observed during the time of persecution. In other words, the first Hanukkah is less a winter festival of cozy candles and more a delayed Sukkot victory banquet, part purification rite, part national holiday, with no bridals in sight. Now, you may be wondering, where in these earliest accounts is the famous miracle of the oil? The one where a single cruse, enough for one day, burns for 8. The answer is simple and quietly unsettling. It is not there. 1st and 2nd Maccabees, our main narrative sources from the 2nd century before the Common Era, describe no such miracle. They mention lights and lamps, yes, but as part of the general joy and symbolism of rededication. The focus is overwhelmingly on the military victory and the political restoration of Jewish worship. The story, as many people know it, the little jar of oil that would not go out, will not appear in Jewish texts for roughly 600 years. This gap is important, and we will come back to it. It is one of those details that sits innocently in the corner of the room until you look at the dates, and then the atmosphere shifts. For now, we move forward a century or so. The family of Mattathias, the Hasmoneans, do not simply fade back into rural priestly life after liberating the temple. They become the ruling dynasty of Judea. For about 100 years, from the mid-2nd century until Rome steps in around the mid-1st century before the Common Era, they are kings in all but name. At first glance, this seems the perfect ending. Courageous fighters of faith, now governing a semi-independent Judean state. But here is where things turn darker. The Hasmoneans, like many revolutionary leaders who become rulers, begin to resemble some of the powers they once resisted. Hasmonean kings expand their territory through warfare. They forcibly incorporate neighboring populations, including the Idumeans, requiring them to adopt Jewish practices. They maneuver for support among emerging Roman powers. They also take on both priestly and royal roles, blurring boundaries that earlier Jewish tradition had kept distinct. Internal dissent is suppressed, rival claimants imprisoned or killed. By the time of later rulers like Alexander Jannaeus, the dynasty is notorious for its brutality toward internal opponents as well as external foes. So, the feast that begins with a revolt for religious integrity gradually becomes tied to a regime that enforces its own brand of orthodoxy with the sword. This is not usually part of the children's version of the holiday. Now, what happens to the memory of all this? Here the story moves, quietly but decisively, from battlefields and palaces into the study halls of the rabbis. In the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, Judea rises again against a foreign empire, this time Rome. The Great Revolt leads to the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. A later uprising, the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s, ends in even more catastrophic defeat. After these disasters, open talk of militant messiahs and armed liberation becomes dangerous and perhaps also theologically risky. The temple is gone. The sacrificial system cannot be restored. The idea of a holiday that glorifies a successful armed revolt and the founding of a royal dynasty begins to sit uneasily in this new world. Enter the rabbis of the Talmud, particularly in the academies of Babylonia, between roughly the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era. In the tractate known as Shabbat, there is a small but immensely influential passage that asks, almost offhandedly, what is Hanukkah? And here, at last, we meet the oil. According to this rabbinic account, when the Hasmoneans entered the defiled temple, they found only one cruse of pure oil, still sealed with the mark of the high priest. It contained enough to burn for 1 day, yet miraculously it lasted 8 days until new oil could be made. Therefore, the rabbis explain, Hanukkah was established as 8 days of praise and thanksgiving, commemorated with the lighting of lamps. This version of the story is upstream from almost everything that follows. The number of candles, the emphasis on light as a symbol of divine presence, the relative absence of explicit military triumph from the liturgy. It is elegant, theologically rich, and in many ways safer. It draws attention away from human kings and toward divine providence. It shifts Hanukkah from a nationalistic commemoration of victory to a more spiritual meditation on endurance and hidden miracles. But it also raises a disquieting question. Why does this central miracle appear only after centuries of silence in the written record? Were earlier authors simply uninterested in it, focusing on politics instead? Did the story circulate orally for generations before being written down? Or did later rabbis, living in the shadow of failed revolts, find it necessary to refract the old holiday through a new lens, to emphasize dependence on God over confidence in the sword? Scholars offer different interpretations. Some suggest that the miracle tale was always part of popular memory and only later deemed worthy of formal treatment. Others see in it a deliberate recasting, an attempt to preserve the holiday while softening its potentially subversive implications under Roman and later Byzantine rule. Whatever the case, the effect is striking. The Hanukkah most people recognize today, candles, blessings, a story of unlikely light, rests on a narrative layer that is historically late and theologically curated. Meanwhile, the older, harsher elements remain in the shadows. The early text's emphasis on destroying idols and punishing Jewish collaborators. The Hasmoneans' later enforcement of religious uniformity. The way the original 8-day feast seems modeled on Sukkot, a festival of harvest and hospitality, but repurposed through the lens of war. These details do not disappear. They simply live lower down in the iceberg of memory, visible mostly to those who go looking. And what of the feast itself? The foods, the conviviality? Our modern tables covered with fried delicacies owe much to the oil motif. Latkes, sufganiot, and other dishes are symbolically tied to that small cruse in the Talmudic story. Yet, knowing the earlier history, one might say the oil on the pan carries two memories at once: the later miracle of gentle light, and the older, rougher tale of rebels in the hills, of altars torn down and rebuilt, of a society tearing itself apart over how much of the surrounding culture it could safely absorb. To my mind, this double exposure is what makes the Hanukkah feast quietly unsettling. It is, at once, a celebration of religious persistence and a commemoration of violence. A family holiday born out of a civil war. A spiritualized miracle layered over a very worldly struggle for power. None of this diminishes its beauty, but it makes the glow of the candles a more complex sort of illumination. We will not resolve all these tensions here. Instead, perhaps we can step back one more time and ask a broader question. Why do we, across cultures and centuries, cling to such physical traces of our stories? Lamps, relics, special foods, small flames in dark seasons. Part of the answer, I suspect, is that we are uneasy with abstraction alone. Faith, memory, and identity are difficult to hold in the mind for long. They ask a lot of our imagination. A lamp that burns just a little longer than it should. A piece of fried dough glistening with oil, a particular date on a calendar repeated every year. These are anchors. They let us touch what might otherwise slip away. But anchors also fix us to particular interpretations. By choosing which details to remember, a miracle of oil instead of a dynasty's later cruelties, a family game instead of a purge of collaborators. We are not only recalling the past, we are editing it. Hanukkah's evolution from battlefield commemoration to Festival of Lights is, in this sense, a case study in how communities decide what kind of story they can bear to tell about themselves. And perhaps this is the final, quiet darkness at the edge of the feast. The realization that every warm ritual is also a curated memory, every shining candle casting shadows that fall on what we have chosen not to emphasize. Still, the lights are real. The songs are sung. Families gather, as they have for centuries, around small flames in early winter. They remember oppression and resilience, sometimes in simplified form, sometimes with deeper layers intact. And in doing so, they join a very human, very ancient pattern, using food, fire, and story to reach back toward a past that is never quite as simple as we would like. Thank you for walking through these darker corridors of the Hanukkah story. As with any old house, some rooms are bright and welcoming, others more shadowed, but all of them belong to the same structure. Until next time, may your lights burn steadily, and may the histories behind them continue to invite questions as well as comfort.